Dax Devlon Ross, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Oh, and I'm beyond thrilled to be in this conversation for so many different reasons, not the least of which was that it's centered around, or at least we're based in, I'm here in DC. So it's just nice to have a local conversation, and I'm excited to be part of it.
It is, and it's great to have a real thought leader in space move back to DC. So I'm really excited to see
Mm-hmm.
that. Now, again, as you know, Dax, I start all of these conversations with people about their upbringing because I do think our upbringing has a big impact on us. And your upbringing is a basis for a lot of what you have written, including in your book. So I want to spend a little bit more time on your own upbringing here
Yeah,
in the greater Washington, D.C. region. But
yeah.
before we get to that, you use a picture of your father and you do a beautiful job of describing the world through your father's eyes and the
Mm,
impact that had on you. I would
mm,
like to first start with that before then getting into a little bit of your own journey.
yeah. Thank you for asking that. I feel like my father's been gone for, he's not been with us for 16 years, but there's not been a day that he is not intimately involved in my intellectual life, my spiritual life. And I feel like in many ways, I hope that if he's able to see me, he sees that I'm living out a lot of the things that we talked about, the things we planned for, the seeds that he planted in me. My father was born in Richmond, Virginia, in 1941. So you figure this is middle of the war, so he is not a boomer. He is a member of what is called the silent generation. This is this sort of in between age that people often don't talk about as much. But so he's born at a time that in a city, I think, that is still undergoing and living through segregation and the vestiges of that, the era of Jim Crow, and very much in the heart of Jim Crow. His father and his mother, two very determined people. My grandparents, my grandfather owned a body shop, and he used to work on cars, and he had his own body shop. And I remember going, I could still smell the paint. You know, I have to say, unfortunately, he died of emphysema, and I think a lot of it had to do with inhalation of, the lead paint over all those years. But it was still a really profound experience as a young person to go to Richmond and have a grandfather who was his own man. He worked for himself. And so I think that in many ways affected my father growing up because his own worldview was being shaped by, even in the midst of living in the South, being shaped by having a father who was his own man, who was able to determine his own life in many ways by being his own boss. And so I believe in many ways my father's aspiration growing up was very much the same, to be a man of that could make his own way in the world. So he grows up in the 1940s and the 1950s, and ultimately, as I've been told and the information has been passed down to me, took one of what's the standardized test at the time and did really, really well. Apparently, he wasn't the best student at the time. He was a good student, but apparently did off the charts in this test. So well that he was awarded a scholarship to the University of Virginia. However, when they found out that he was Black, um, they actually, the they being, in parentheses, I don't know who the they was, but the powers that be at the time paid for him to go to Howard University. And so his move to DC, I think, is in many ways the genesis of my life because he arrives in DC at a time when a number of folks are arriving in DC, I think, that end up becoming and creating a generational shift. Because as I'm growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, I'm surrounded by people in Washington, DC, who are his peers, his colleagues, his friends, my mother's friends as well. And these were Black folks, mostly Black folks, who had gone through or been in some ways, some way, shape, or form impacted by Howard University. So much so that I tell people when I went to when I grew up, I would mistake Howard and Harvard. I didn't I didn't understand that there was this other place called Harvard because the only thing that seemed to matter was Howard and being on the yard, and everybody I knew had these really rich experiences there. it didn't even occur to me that it was an HBCU. Like the concept of it being an HBCU was foreign to me. It just was. And it was just part of a DC that at that time when I was growing up was a majority Black city. And so everything that I think I try to tell these stories because my upbringing in many ways was like an inverted experience inside this little bubble in a particular moment in time. And my father being emblematic of the men of his generation, being a first in his family to go to college, first to graduate, able to sort of pursue this professional career in these traditionally predominantly white spaces, and him being able to then send his children into, you know, these predominantly white institutions for their education as a choice was major. Um, I you know I would say that, you know, my father has he said to me when I decided I wanted to be a writer, and no one in my life had been a writer, and I didn't know anybody who was a writer, but he had this sentiment, and I remember either he wrote it to me because he would write these letters, these handwritten letters to me. We would have these long conversations, especially into my early 20s when I was still figuring out my life. We'd have these deep, long conversations well into the night, and then I'd get a letter in the mail a couple of days later where he'd been ruminating over what we talked about. And typically there was a book along with it with certain things that had been highlighted for me to read. Nothing harsh. It was just like, just check this out. You know, give this a whirl. But I like to say that my father viewed his grandfather's life as one in which he was a mechanic. He worked with his hands. My father became an engineer. So he also was in many ways, he was working with his mind. And he also recognized that he had to make a choice in a very practical way. I think he wanted to be an artist himself. And he also recognized that as part of the generation that was a first, didn't have that luxury. He really needed to make a practical choice, and engineering was a very practical choice that he could merge together some of the artistic desire and some of his aspirations. And so that I come along, and in many ways, although I do go to law school and have this kind of formal education, when I decide that I want to pursue my career as a writer, he says to me that in many ways, I've done these things and made these choices so that you can make the choice that you're making right now. And if there was anybody in my life early on when I was starting to write and I was very clunky and still figuring it out and didn't know what I was doing, who supported me was always him. I never had to feel like I needed to justify the choices that I was making about my life because he was proud of them. He admired it. I think in some ways he reveled in the notion of that his son could do this, could try this thing out in the world. That means a lot. And I carry that with me because it feels like, and sometimes when I've decided, when I've wanted to not pursue the things that I want to pursue, I'm like, how dare you? How dare you not pursue the things that people have broken down barriers, walked through doors, stood in the gap, stood in the whatever it is, stood in the river. They've made the bridge for you to do this thing. And so what if it's hard or if it's just a bit of a struggle? Get to it. And I have now I have a boy who's going to be born. And I have a beautiful daughter too. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me. And I have a son who was actually supposed to be born on my father's birthday. And that was like a mind blower. We found out that his due date was my father's birthday. I was like, oh, he's here, but he'll be arriving in a few days from now. And I keep thinking that because of all the things generationally that have happened to me, I get to then allow him to think big, broad, bold about what he wants to do with his life. So what that next thing might be for him, I'm so excited. And for my daughter, of course, as well. For them, I'm really excited. But that's the part of the legacy, and that's the legacy I'm proud to be a part of. And I think it's a legacy sometimes that in our country we don't have enough of a language to really talk about and explore, and such that I felt compelled to like tell my story and talk about this story. Not that it's special, but that it's uniquely unremarkable in the community I grew up in. I am uniquely unremarkable relative to the friends in the neighborhood, in the city that I know to be the one I grew up in.
Dax, what a beautiful way of describing the sacrifices and the groundbreaking that your father did that gave you the opportunities, because I see a lot of desire in you to make a difference in the world around you for your daughter, your son, my daughters of the future. So, in addition to your own thought leadership, there's almost a sense of responsibility that I can sense you have to your father and to your grandfather for the sacrifices they made to afford you the opportunities you've been able to take advantage of.
Responsibility is, I guess, at the best word that we have for it. I'd even go so far to call it a debt, you know. Um, and I would include my mom centrally in that as well. Like I feel like in many ways, the my father, there was a certain erudition and a certain discipline and a certain fortitude that my father exemplified. And then I think the social justice responsibility to one's folks, whatever those folks might be, whoever those folks might be, that actually explicitly comes from my mother. Like, and my father was the one who was symbolizing it through his actions, but then my mother was definitely the one who was verbalizing it in her words. Who are, like, knowing who you are, who raised you, who supports you. So and I'm very conscious of the fact that that often in my work I center my father, and I think about his journey, and I feel the need, especially as I get older, and I recognize part of it has to do with the fact that my mom's always been here. And because she's been here for the last 16, 17 years, and my father, I could just call her. I could drive to see her now. She's a part of my life, and I don't feel like I maybe give as much voice to the honor that I have, that, for her and to the choices that she made. I always say that my parents divorced when I was 9 years old, and everyone expected my mom to just close up shop and just go back to Virginia, because at that point she had worked only in the home, and I hate to say only in the home. I'm sorry for saying it that way. Her work had been in the domestic space, in our house, in our home, taking care of us. She didn't do that though. She went and she found and made a career for herself. This is a woman who didn't have a college education, college degree, but she found and made a way for herself in the world in such a way that she's widely respected in the city, DC. And I find that out all the time when I go around. Like, she's done a lot of work for small businesses, to help small businesses, and that's where she expresses her responsibility. So you talk about this word responsibility; it's endemic to who I am, and I think to my own intellectual formation. So separate from my father or my mother, if someone were to ask me, like, who were the writers that inspired you and what made you think about becoming a writer, I don't think I ever felt like I had the luxury just to write, just to sort of write. I felt like the writing that I would do and the thought, therefore the thinking that I would do, needed to be connected to social change, social justice, social action. I just didn't see it any other way. That was my impulse. And also the models that I was reared around. I'm talking about call them the Holy Trinity of Baldwin, of Ellison and Wright. Add into that mix, of course, you have Toni Morrison, who's incredibly important, Alice Walker. So I have all, but that work is really incredibly vital to why I wanted to become a writer, and then therefore what kind of writing I continue to do in the world. And it's responsibility work, it's debt work, and it's work knowing that nobody else is going to do it, so you better do it, because if we don't do it, then I can't expect anybody else to do it. If I don't honor my histories, I don't tell these stories, then I can't expect somebody else to.
So, Dex, you have that sense of responsibility. You had that model in your father and your mother. You also had a very unique upbringing in that you had to navigate three very different worlds. A world of growing up in a middle class black family in Sheppard Park in
Mm-hmm.
DC, a world of Sidwell Friends, one of the most exclusive, if not the most exclusive high school in the entire country. Imagine primarily white. And then playing basketball with friends in downtown DC. Those are three different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
How were you able to navigate those three worlds?
And that triangle. it never really, it didn't form and become clear to me that that geography of the city um, was my birthright. Well, not my birthright, but it was, what is the word that I'm looking for? It just didn't occur to me until I was much older that that was how my life was patterned. And in many ways, that pattern formed so much of how I experienced and show up in the world. I think that, it was hard. It was really hard because when you're 14, 15, 16 years old, um, there isn't a language to articulate the things that you feel like you're experiencing, because it's not as if my parents could talk. It was something different for them. And it also was happening in a very specific geography at a specific time. I'd say the basketball piece was, there was a desire and a hunger for me, like to be in the absolute best basketball environment possible. I think, I knew growing up uptown as it was, I was like, this ain't the best basketball. It ain't it, right? It is okay, but if I really want to do it, then I'm gonna have to go here. I gotta go to the hood. And it never even crossed my mind. Like, there was no fear. It was like, that's where I gotta go. And I think on some level, there's not the Sidwell experience, and Sidwell has changed dramatically. Like, I think when I was there, it's become, I think, even more of a sort of symbol of privilege than even when I was there in the 80s and 90s. I think at that time, it was sort of like people knew about it. It was a school in DC, but like, it has become something else now. But nevertheless, when the opportunity came, I think similarly, I was like, the challenge seemed to me really exciting. Even as a sixth grader going this, everyone's like, I want that challenge. I don't know what it is, but it seemed like an amazing opportunity for an education. And it, to the extent that one can at 12, 13 years old, I think I wanted that. I wanted that. So I think the connective tissue, even why I moved to New York for 20 years and lived in the city and moved around and bounced around, it's like, I'm one who believes that you throw yourself into the fire, and I feel like that's how your metal is formed. So so part of how I did it was, I have this constitution personally that I can do anything. You put me anywhere, I'm gonna find a way to succeed, whatever success could look like, and how I'll define it myself. But I have firmly felt, and I think so much of it was formed in that neighborhood, Sheppard Park. So that's the origin, like, that's the cauldron in which this sort of, the formation took place, so that I could go out to these other two worlds, two very different worlds, one downtown DC in the 1980s, and one, of course, this very sort of prestigious school, and feel as though I could find a way to belong in both those places, even though I had a lot of pushback in both those places, like, because there was something central about the home, this community that had given me a clear sense of who I was, and a sense of confidence about myself, that I could do it. There was no environment in which I couldn't be successful. And I hold that to this day.
There's both a clear sense of identity, Dax, and an ability to empathize with and connect with people in different worlds that I see in your writing and in your thinking. And it's really important for us to understand as we want to bring more people along in the conversation around
Mm.
race and the systemic racism that has existed. So I think from childhood, you were able to operate in these different environments and learn how to engage and connect. Curious also, you were in ninth grade when the Rodney King beating happened. So ninth grade, going to Sidwell Friends, and your best friend growing up, who became sort of the reason for you writing the letter to my male friends later on, was also your friend back then. As a young black boy in a school like Sidwell Friends, were there ever conversations? Were there things going through your mind that you didn't share with others? What was going through your mind at that point in time? Do you recall?
Mm-hmm. I think in many ways at that point in my life, I felt my job was to make and to be that's in that school, in that environment, was to be accommodating to white people. Meaning, do not make it just uncomfortable for them. I think there's something that happens to people, specifically people of color in white dominant sort of environments, where you are socialized to capitulate and just to sort of accommodate and to not, and in some ways, because what happens in that environment is that you're fed this narrative of your exceptionalism, that you don't, and I'm going to speak in the first person, that I didn't feel like I had a valid way of entering a conversation around race, because I had this sort of privilege of being in that environment. And I think in some ways, unfortunately, even white people who were my peers in that space would inadvertently and unconsciously, and without meaning intending it to be malicious, would sort of look at my blackness as a qualified blackness, as a different than other people's blackness. And I think in some ways, I actually sort of came to never embrace it, but to accept that. And so when Rodney King happens, it's horrific to watch it. I think it's different only insofar as like he was a grown man. And so what we've seen in this sort of more modern iteration of police violence has been these younger bodies that have, some of these younger bodies that have affected, that have enacted. And so what I knew to be true in 10th grade, though, was that obviously that was wrong, but it felt in many ways so foreign to me and to my experience that I don't think I had this, and some people in my school did. Some of the black kids in my school did. They got out, they were involved. Like, I think I kind of sought cover in basketball and sort of, and in continuing to not really make waves and to not get involved. And it wasn't until I'm like in 11th and 12th grade in which I start to actually have, when I have a driver's license and I start to actually experience police violence myself. And specifically in 12th grade, I do have these very intense experiences that begin. And I tell people, I would say from the ages of 17 to my early 30s, I had at least one encounter a year with the police. So just think about that. I would say for almost 17 years of my life, there wasn't a year that went by that I did not have an encounter with law enforcement. And trust me, I was not going to hang out with them. It wasn't like I was going to seek it out, but it was like, it was so I was still a little it was still before, I was still in a cocoon, so to speak. The cocoon that my family had built for me had persisted in some way. So even though I played in the hood and had those experiences, even then I was sort of, there's still a protectiveness because I was playing basketball. And I will say, playing, if you're a good basketball player in any city in America, I think, it is almost like a get out of jail free card. It is like people look out for you, they protect you, they don't let you see certain things, they guide you places, you get taken care of from a very young age if you demonstrate and so any kind of skill or talent. So I was one of those kids who was good enough at that sport that I had adults around who were steering me away from or shielding me from things that I didn't have to. So even if I went to a basketball court that was in Southeast at the time, I was coming into that space with adults and people who were looking for things that I wasn't even thinking about. And those people, I honor those people because they were protecting me, but I had to come ultimately to my own awareness of these things, my own experience of these things, because they can only protect you for so long.
So you had come to that awareness out of your cocoon for
Yeah,
years, and at a certain point in 2020
yeah,
June,
yeah,
you decided, you know what, it's time for me to speak the truth to my well-meaning, well-intentioned friends. So
yeah,
what initiated that first letter to my white male friends of a certain age that
yeah,
you sat down and you wrote?
yeah. I I mean, I tell people like I had taken some real time off of writing. There was a period, 2015 or so, and I said, I'm gonna put the pen down. I had been kind of going at it hard, and something said to me that um, I needed to sort of do some other things, get some other experiences, change my relationship to writing in ways. I feel like I was forcing it. I feel like I was forcing things. And I think what that letter and what was underneath that was I had spent some time in quiet. I had done some quiet time work of reflecting on what do I really want. In that period, in that time I turned 40 and I started to go into so I think I was leading up to that moment without any, of course, no knowledge that would happen, but there had been enough. I had done a lot of digesting and processing and really doing what I think we could do a lot more of in this country, which is observe, take note, be in a listening space, in a learning space. And I think at that moment, there were some things that it was almost like there was this jumble that had been working its way through me that finally kind of like straightened itself out. It stretched out and it became this sort of very clear and crystal expression that I wanted to put into the world that felt authentically what I always wanted to communicate as a writer and how I wanted to always communicate as a writer. And I felt like I both had the experience and, to be quite honest, I had done the humility work that could allow me to communicate in a way that I think has been received as empathetic, as you've already used that word. But I also encountered and interacted and gone through and done enough work with institutions that are led by well-meaning liberal white folks. And I was just frankly tired, just really tired of the ways in which the stories about Black folks, people of color, get told in this country, and who gets to tell those stories. I'm just tired of it, because I feel like you're telling a story that is self-serving. You're telling a story that is and I find it happening, and that's why for me, I worked in the nonprofit space, and a lot of my work continues to be. But I feel like I felt as though there was still like and it tended to be a kind of condescension that permeates a patronizing way in which issues around race can be talked about, issues around systemic injustice can be talked about, and they can be talked about that way, and because the people who are often talking about it are not physically threatened by or do not have to feel as though their lives are the ones that are ultimately at risk. And so to me, it was a point at which I was like, and especially with my friends and the people that I was connecting to, I was like, guys, we're here now. This is it. There's no practice. These are the moments that will define your life, and the people you will look back on, everyone will look back on and say, where were you? How did you show up? What are you waiting for? If you really have this belief, don't just tell me in the bar when we're having a drink. Don't just tell me in a whisper or send me a side text message. I don't really need that, actually. I'm good. What I need, if you actually show up, is to show in a public way. And I think that's hard because there's risk involved in that. But I don't have the luxury just because of how I present in the world, I don't have the luxury of doing certain calculus around risks that I will and will not take. There is some calculus I can take, absolutely, because I do it all the time. But like when it comes to that thing, to the sort of racialized violence that we're seeing, both the physical, the emotional. So I just think that it demands, these times demand us to have a more honest reckoning, and not just a reckoning on the terms of the people who have tended historically to have power. Like you can't just, and I talk about in the book, like what has frustrated me historically as I've done my own research. So part of what I was doing when I was quiet in my listening is I was reading a lot. One of the things you encounter and you understand is that this isn't the first. We have this country has, we work through, this country has cycles, and the cycles of unrest. But who gets to decide when the unrest is done? Who gets to decide when we're no longer going to have these conversations? Who gets to decide when, we've gone far enough with that initiative? It is typically and historically been the very same people who have always had power, which are white folks. And so my challenge in in my work is like, what if we said that you don't get to decide all the terms of this? You don't get to decide how it looks. You can be in the part of the conversation. You can be at the table, but you don't get to sit at the head of the table automatically, just by default. Just because you happen to have the resources shouldn't mean you get to dictate the terms of the discussion. And so I wanted to start that and wrestle with that. Because it is clear. I was like, I'm saying be at the table, but let's have a round table instead of a long boardroom table. A round table means that we can all be at it. And that to me, and I think about my Sidwell experiences, that was very much, and I write about in the book, like one of the things that was really powerful about the way in which many of my classrooms were set up was that sort of circle, a learning circle, where we see everybody's face. They're in the teacher and the educator is part of that circle, not above that circle, not outside that circle. It's part of that circle. So I believe those things, they encoded themselves in me in many ways, show up in the ways in which I talk about how I think we all need to show up in these conversations, and not just in the conversation, and then the work that has to follow the conversation.
In that in most instances, we want to only blame the system, and there's a lot to be blamed in the system. However, our thinking, our questions,
Yeah.
our labeling of things
Yeah.
have a real impact.
Real impact. Real impact. I love the way you just said it, our labeling of things. I mean, if you think about it, we've known that we've seen people a decade and a half ago. We saw these resume studies that were done around what happens when you have a name that might in some way indicate that it might have some kind of, it might be racial or something. Like we know, same resume, we know. And if you were to ask the people who were looking at those resumes, are you racist? They would say no. They would deny it. So we've got all this implicit, all the information we've learned in the last 2 decades around implicit bias, and still people think that they can game the system. That, I think what folks need to understand is that you can't game this thing. That's how deep and pervasive it is that we are all implicated in it. And unless you're doing some work in some capacity to unlock, undo, reframe, and rethink, there's a high possibility, perhaps probability, that you are infected by some of these latent beliefs that live in our society. These are latent beliefs that have been woven in over hundreds of years. It's not like you didn't create them, I didn't create them, we were born into them.
And we all have to accept that in order to be able to improve on it, Dax. I had an interesting experience about a month or so back where I get lobbied by authors that want to be on the podcast. And this was
Mhm.
an author, their PR agency, that's a best-selling book. And I
Mhm.
asked a simple question. All the examples were 9 white men, 1 white woman. I said,
Mhm.
"Uh, aren't there weren't there other examples?" And the author was really insulted and said, "I
Of
don't
course.
see color." So in that, the stories we tell, the things we do, is
Yeah.
first we need to recognize
Yeah.
that it is insipid, it's in everything we do, it's in everything we say, it's how we view the world. So we have to reframe it in order to be able to understand the world differently. Before we can address it, we have to understand the problem. And in many instances, the problem begins with us, with me.
That's so much of the sort of structure of the book. We talk about, like, the big book begins in part 1. That's why the memoir exists. I tell people, And I didn't write a memoir just to sort of, I don't think my life is so remarkable. I need to write a memoir. I used my journey and the social political context in which it was taking place as a way to invite people to do some of their own reflection around their journey and the social political context that was in place, because we are all raised in context, right? In many ways, that author might have been raised at a time in America when the right and proper thing to say was that I don't see race. Many of my peers have come to me and said, Dax, I'm confused. When I was growing up, everyone was telling me not to see race. And now I'm being told I should see race. There's two things going on. Like, who was telling you not to see race, right? You got to ask the who question, because it was probably people who were most uncomfortable with the idea of race that were telling you not to see race. And contextually speaking, we had just come out of this really, really hard time in America. The 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s were so intensely volatile. I think that just there are points in which a culture does need a cooling off period, a period in which it can sort of like thaw a little, like just cool, chill out a little bit. I get that. Not to say it's right, but I get the sort of, there's a fatigue. And I think we're experiencing and moving into a fatigue period right now, as a matter of fact. I think there's a fatigue upon us. So just knowing who's the source of that information and what was the purpose for which that information was being delivered to you. So, and also recognizing as a lifelong learning, being open to the notion that just like anything else that you feel like you care about and are invested in, your learning is always happening. I think what people would like when it comes to conversations around difference, race, sexuality, gender, identity, is that they could reach a static point in which they have figured it out so they could move on. I had a call yesterday, running a session with a leadership team with an organism, with the company, as a matter of fact. And this was the end of a 3-hour session we had done. We had done multiple 3-hour sessions of learning work with the group. And this last session was really working on some theme of allyship and how to build some of the theoretical frameworks and also build some of the practical skills. And the CEO's last remarks were, like, this is just too long. We need to be able to do this in a much shorter fashion. And I just feel like I think, it is really problematic to say to a person of color, like, this takes too long. I'm like, I can talk to you about some things that are taking too long, right? So if you want to talk about things taking too long, your entire senior leadership team is white. Let's talk about some things that take too long, right? But then beyond that, it's like this underneath that is just give me the tools. Just give me the thing so I can have it and I can use it and I can be done with this. And I always say to folks, just like you and I have done in this conversation, there's actually a joy in this work if you allow for it. There's laughter in this work if you allow for it. But you got to work to that place, meaning develop the competency so that you can see this thing for what it is, which is absurd, actually, which is actually ridiculous, which is that we've created this sort of tribalism, and then we've kind of built this sort of factionalism, and we sort of undergirded it with these ideas around physical difference and appearance as a way to distinguish between people and the whole have and have nots. Like, that is, for a civilized, quote unquote, society, that we do this to one another. It is both disturbing, and you must find, like, in order to survive and get through, you have to find some levity around it, because it's ridiculous. But that's what I want people to think. If you only approach this as arduous labor, then of course you want it to be done. But if you approach it as like, this is my opportunity to maybe connect deeper with myself, connect with others that maybe I have not connected with, to build relationship and community, and maybe even to like interrogate some of the things that I have come to believe need to be true about my own, like this idea of, I think I see a lot in sort of the ways in which people attach themselves very deeply to rationalism as like the end all be all for any kind of discourse. Like, what is so wrong with why have we allowed for, people who have different ways of knowing and thinking about the world? Why do we put them and assume that those other ways of being and knowing are less valid than rationalism? Now, I went to law school. I'm a believer in rationalism, but I also believe that we have to find space for other kinds of knowing, intuition, has a space in our world. Right? Spirit has a space in our world. Love has a space in our world. Some of those things can't just be rationalized. You can't find the formula for all that stuff. It just is, you know? And so I will also, part of what I'm getting at is I want folks to get better at getting closer proximity and better relationship and more in touch with some of that stuff too. Because life becomes actually more joyful when you don't drive through a neighborhood of color and think that you're going to be robbed or that something's going to happen bad to you, or that you see a community that is maybe not as well-to-do as yours and assume that the children don't have fathers and assume that they have a bad education and assume all these things, so that you're ultimately surprised whenever you find that one young person who is a gem and they've got all these wonderful, like, part of what you've allowed yourself to believe is that that physical space is a definer of all the things about those people inside of those space, without recognizing there are structural impediments. But those structural impediments don't get in the way of love. They don't block intelligence. They don't mean that people aren't trying to work hard and get themselves into different life conditions.
Which is why I think, Dax, your book is a great way of how I see you tackling some societal issues with some personal stories and some political elements that we
Yeah.
all need to think about and address. Now, you start your book, and I would love for you to tell the story about you watching a square dancer in South Africa.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, I've been looking for 20 years. For 20 years, I've been trying to find a way to tell that story
And
or to use that
you
story.
did. So
It's in,
it's a great way to start your book.
it's in there. So I'm in South Africa, studying law, enjoying life at the bar with my friends. I look over and I see this guy. He's moonwalking. He's just moonwalking in a club. People are dancing. Like, he is moonwalking around the perimeter of the dance floor. And it just struck me as so, at first, amusing, entirely amusing. Like, first of all, this guy, like, he must be completely drunk. What is he doing? Like, who moonwalks in a club by themselves? Like, that's not something you do. It's not a dance move. What do you do? But then I'm intrigued. And so I go up onto the balcony and I remember just looking down and watching this dude go round and round. And he was having the best time. And I felt like in that moment, it was like there was a certain liberation that I was drawn to that I didn't feel in my own life at that time. And part of what and I think what we often do when we see those kinds of people is we ridicule them. We ridicule and we let that be the end of it. When if we do some deeper inquiry and investigation, we see that maybe there's something that they're doing that we wish we could do. If not, I didn't want to go moonwalk, but there's something metaphorically that I saw in that liberation. And I think even from me, I've come to deeper understandings about the meanings of that scene in relation to this book. As people have interpreted what I'm up to in this project, in this story, in this book that I'm writing, I've heard folks say, well, bless you almost like for having this kind of empathy, or, the fact that you have hope is great, or, I think you almost let white guys off a little too easy. Like there's like this thing that I think people have in their mind around how a Black person's supposed to express their feelings about white people, and particularly, for me, it's my white friends. And I say this in the opening, my journey has been one that has really been rooted and steeped in a post-civil rights America. And I've had opportunities and privileges that have put me in proximity to people who've become deeply important to my life. That wasn't an advantage, that wasn't an opportunity or set of relationships my dad could have. And I say could have because I think it has really enriched my life that I have these friendships. And so for me to grandstand now and act as if those people aren't important to me, those friends don't mean something to me, that I don't love them and they don't love me and that we don't have each other, just because I see that there's room for them to grow, for me to cancel them, I won't do that. I'm going to create a new narrative. a new narrative that includes them and me and all the other we's out here who don't feel included. I'm not going to do the popular thing that might be happening on social media, which is, X, Y, and Z, so I can get some claps and some thumbs ups and some yes, say no, I don't, that's not what this is about. I have to do it true. And so therefore there's some liberation that I saw that person. Not that there's an indifference to others, but that there's because he had to be aware of people spatially who are around him, but there's a decision that I'm not going to allow other people's ideas about who I should be, how I should show up, who I should be friends with, who I should care about, how I should think about these things to determine my choices and if you align with that, cool, this book is for you. If you don't, then hopefully you'll find something in there that you'll at least understand that I'm authentically telling my story. I'm not doing this to get kudos from someone. I'm not doing this I'm doing this because this is my truth. This is my experience. This is the world I grew up in. And in many ways, I refuse, to allow for the world that some are, even here in Washington, would want to paint the picture of it being to dominate and permeate. I actually think it is much more nuanced than that. We are much more bound together than it is allowed, than we are allowed to sort of have a narrative around. So the punditry that sort of permeates our culture and that dominates the narrative operates at these sort of polarities. And so therefore you cannot get enough, you don't get the opportunity for nuance to be something that we engage with and grapple with. I say, as long as you're going to sit down, I'm going to sit down. As long as we're going to be in the conversation, I'm in the conversation. As long as I don't need you to be already there yet, because you know what? It takes time and you haven't done the work. But what I need you to do is to make some kind of commitment and hold yourself accountable and be visibly and publicly accountable to that.
And that nuance comes across in your writing, Dax, which is why I think one of the best things that leaders can do is to read books like yours, again, part in understanding your experience, but part because you interject a lot of social and political elements that is also really important for us to have conversations and dialogue
Yeah.
around to continually expand our own understanding. Now, I wonder, in addition to your own book, what resources do you recommend to leaders as they want to go on this journey?
So, there's actually, if I'm talking to my leaders in the nonprofit space, I actually say that there's a book that they should probably start with themselves, which is called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. It's a grassroots book that came out a number of years ago. That it's a series of essays that really kind of explore the unvarnished, in an unvarnished way, the sort of the sector. And I think it's really kind of telling some alternative origin stories, alternative narratives that were enlightening for me and helped me understand in many ways why and how the sector operates and navigates itself. So I think there's a book like that. I always say it's a really important read. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. There's a book that I keep by my side and I read it quite often. It's called Adaptive Leadership, and it's a very practical text that I'm sure that folks in leadership Washington, Greater Washington, might have some familiarity with the work around adaptive leadership. I feel the work that I do, it melds adaptive leadership with a DEI frame. I bring those together because I feel like adaptive leadership, without saying as much, and perhaps because I don't know, for whatever reason, it is ultimately work that is, if done in the right way, is about systematizing equitable practices in a variety of ways. Like I think about the words, like the sort of values of giving, to the sort of recognizing and honoring the voices from below. It's one of the central tenets, protecting the voices from below. Well, that's what's happening right now. We have a lot of people who don't have positional power and authority, who are speaking truths to us about our organizations and corporations, and because they're the ones living the stuff, then we could decide to block them out, shut them down, fire them, or we could listen to what they have to say. We could protect that voice. We could find the truth in that. You know, I think similarly, this idea of giving the work back to the people for them to do that work. You know, I think really the best leaders, you know, people always say, oh, I empower my people to do their thing. I think it's more than just empowering people. I think you got to create the container for them to do the work into. And the creation of the container is really, really critical, and holding the container for people. Don't just give them the work and say, go, I'm empowering you to do it. Like, people need more of the leader does create some important boundaries, some important structures, some important rules of engagement so that people can do the work that you want them to do. So adaptive leadership is really a foundational and formational text that I use. There's this work by this woman named Adrienne Brown called Emergent. Why am I forgetting the last name of it? Emergent. I gotta look it up for you. I gotta give it to you now. You gotta have it, because this book actually really in many ways changed my emergent strategy. You know, it's by Adrienne Marie Brown. I read this book probably 3 or 4 years ago, and it made me want to write again. The way this woman structured and constructed this narrative, and the way she talks about her own journey as a leader and what it did to her, and therefore why she needed to transform the way she led, but also what leadership looked like, and sort of decentralizing herself. I would say that some of those echoes are in the ways I write about my experience as well, because I think, and I write, and I'm thinking about this a lot more. What I am hungry for, and what I really am drawn to, is a radical kind of honesty that leaders are able to practice in the public space and in the public way with their people, that trusts their people to be able to hear the truth of something and still believe in the thing that we're up to. So to kind of give an example to that, like, I think what I mean is that I feel like CEOs' jobs, some CEOs believe their job is to tell people that everything is going to be all right, is to protect people from hard truths, to give them the information that I think we're past that now. We're just not in that space anymore. People are not responding to that. We just lived through a pandemic. Like, we can deal with some truth. People can deal with some truth. So I think what they're hoping for is when folks and leaders can really kind of open up and examine moments in their own leadership lives where they've fallen short of their own expectations, what they wanted to be. And the fear that will turn people off, or that they will lose people, I think is misguided. What I find is that brings people in more. That vulnerability, that a willingness to sort of reflect in a public way. So that kind of, so I admire when those kind of leaders, when leaders can do that kind of work. I think that, there's some, I actually do think what I hope to be doing more of, and I need to be doing more. For a period of my life, I read a lot of, I was a huge fiction writer and reader. And in more recent years, I've gotten away from doing and spending enough time in the fiction space. And I think I think I need to be back in the fictional space, because fiction isn't that it's not true. It's that it explores possible truths. So I encourage people to think about not just reading sort of nonfiction, but like really engage with fiction in the ways in which it can expand the mind. It can kind of play with language and terminology. And so therefore, to that end, what I do, I read a lot of comic books. I read comic books, man. And I call them comic books, not graphic novels. Because when I was a kid, my literature was the Marvel Universe. And in many ways, the origins, like my understanding of origin stories, the importance of origin stories, the importance of the hero's journey, the journey that people go on, the importance of friendship across difference, I think about the relationship between, Professor Xavier and oh God, why am I forgetting? And his counterpart of, oh God, Metallic, what's his now? I'm getting his name. There's a whole story behind these two, because they have, and it's rooted in the Holocaust, and how they were both formed through the experience of the Holocaust. When Xavier comes out of that experience, and he is determined to bring sort of humanity together. But his counterpart, Magneto is so embittered by what happens and what he observes in the Holocaust that he has given up on humanity. So he's not a bad person, even though what he does in the world is harmful. And their entire dynamic is around that relationship. It's a very Malcolm and Martin story in many ways. So I think with people, and I think there's a reason why the Marvel universe has become so much more popular in our sort of recent years. It's dealing with archetypes, myths, symbols that give us a way to grapple with some of the things that are happening in our concrete world. So I invite people to recognize that some of the best writing that I'm seeing is happening in that universe, in that world. I go to comic book stores, it's just me and it's like just a bunch of nerds in there, a bunch of dudes who are absolute nerds, and maybe one of them just absolute geeks. They're talking about like this, and it's like there's always these dark, cavernous places, but there's a richness there in that universe, and there's a truth seeking that people are doing. It's not escapism, actually. I don't believe it's escapism. I believe that actually it's a deep engagement with things through metaphor, because that's how we can bring life to things that are unexplicable and unexplainable and we don't have a word, the sort of terminology to grapple with in the quote unquote real world. So I would say that I tell people, man, I'm gonna read, and I hope someday I get to write some comics, man. That shit is everything to me. It forms me. It means a lot to me. So those are I will offer those as some important texts that I find myself engaging with right now. But definitely emergent strategy, definitely revolution will not be funded, definitely adaptive leadership. And right now I'm reading this comic book series. It's called the Universe X, and it's like there's like Earth X, and I'm reading it's like this omnibus. It's like this huge text. It's like thousands of pages, but it tells the story of like a future Earth and a future universe in which everyone has mutant powers. I know I'm getting kind of nerdy right now. I'm nerding out, but it's a fascinating thing for me. I read it in the mornings, as a matter of fact. It's a fascinating thing to think about, because it ultimately is about leadership. It is about how do you make choices, the biggest choices you can make, which are about humanity and the species and the survival. How do you engage? How do you reckon and wrestle with people who've been your enemy your entire life, but you need them now? In this moment, you need them because everything is on the line right now. It doesn't get much deeper than this stuff.
Dax, one of the superpowers you have is similar to Leonardo da Vinci. One of the incredible things that made him a polymath was the ability to use the deep understanding in one area to transfer to other areas.
Thank you.
And that really gave him a superpower. So I see a superpower in you with your ability, whether it is in gaining the hero's journey or some of the storylines from the Marvel comic books, to some of your own personal life experiences in drastically different worlds, to your experiences as a black man in America that has had a gun put to your throat in high school. You are able to capture and bring relevance from lots of different worlds and add value through your content, through your writing. And I am really thrilled that now we have you as a leader back in the greater Washington, D.C. region. So you can add to the conversation, you can ask the questions, and you can help all of us learn and grow together. I really appreciate this conversation and you taking the time for it, Dax Devlon Ross.
I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to you for doing the work that you do, for coming for inviting me to be part of this. I know you get a lot of people who want to come on your show and be part of a conversation like this. So thank you for choosing me and for allowing me to be part of it. I can't wait to meet you in person. I'm here. We're going to do it.
Same here, Dax. Absolutely.